Hi everyone, my team and I will be talking about the importance and consequences of DNA transfer. As we all know, Locard's exchange principle states that when two objects come into contact, an exchange of material happens between them. This is a very important principle to the forensic science field and to law enforcement. When investigating a crime scene, it is extremely important to identify whose DNA was found at a crime scene, and it is also important to determine how the DNA was found at the crime scene. This is important because by having a person's DNA at a crime scene, law enforcement can question their presence at a certain location or their relationship to the victim. In some cases, secondary transfer can be a possibility, which can explain why strangers' DNA can sometimes be found at a crime scene. For example, many people use the mass transportation system, and when they use transportation, they can leave trace evidence such as fibers, hairs, or skin cells. Unfortunately, cases where secondary transfer occurs can easily be misjudged. This is because transfer evidence is used to link an individual to a crime scene, which can implicate a relation to the criminal activity.
Edmond Locard was a French criminologist from France who came up with the idea that every contact leaves a trace, and when dealing with crime scenes, those that were involved will leave something behind as well as take something with them. We know this idea today as Locard's exchange principle. We can apply this principle to the investigation of crime scenes in order to find a trace of what a perpetrator may have left behind. One of the main types of trace evidence sought after at a crime scene is DNA. DNA can be transferred easily in both large or small quantities and is essential in generating leads for a suspect at a crime scene. The transfer of trace DNA evidence means that a surface containing DNA came in contact with another surface in some type of way, and that does not always mean it was a direct transfer between the original source and the surface that the DNA was recovered from. There are many different ways that DNA can be transferred, from primary transfer to quaternary transfer. So, why is DNA evidence so important? Any clues left at the crime scene can give law enforcement information about individuals or objects involved and how they interacted. They can link individuals to a crime scene and determine who touched what. For example, if DNA or fingerprints were found on a gun, was it the suspect who used it or the victim? This can be determined from trace DNA. However, due to the ease of how DNA can be transferred, there are difficulties and consequences that can arise in its implication. As we can see just how easy it is for trace DNA to be transferred from one surface to another, that makes it easy for evidence to be contaminated or interpreted incorrectly. This is why it's important for evidence to be collected and handled properly, and why it's also important for law enforcement officials to take into account that trace DNA recovered from the crime scene may not actually pertain to the crime in question. We can see this issue arise in real life, just as it did in the case of Lucas Anderson.
The case of Lucas Anderson is a prime example of the consequences of secondary exchange. Lucas Anderson was accused and convicted for the murder of Ravish Kumar along with two other men whose DNA was found at the crime scene. There was a problem with this conviction. Anderson had no recollection of the crime he was being accused of and had no ties with the other two men who were part of the same gang. Still, investigators could not deny the fact that his DNA was present on the victim's fingernails. It wasn't until public defender Kelly Kulik reopened the case and found out Lucas Anderson actually had an alibi the night of the murder. It turns out Anderson spent the entire night at the hospital after being picked up by the paramedics for intoxication. Then the question arose, how did Anderson's DNA end up at the crime scene? Kulik and the other investigators discovered the paramedics who picked up Anderson that night were the same first responders at the crime scene. They concluded Anderson's DNA was transferred secondarily through a carrier and he was deemed innocent. The investigators learned that DNA should not be the sole reason one gets convicted. Anderson was nearly sentenced to the death penalty for this crime. This is why DNA's high evidentiary value poses many risks in the justice system.